In September 1981, a group of 4 young explorers vanished while exploring an old abandoned bunker on the Maine coast. They went in during a late summer storm and were never seen again. For 14 years, their families held on to hope, as the official story claimed the sea had simply swallowed them whole. But that was a lie. 14 years later, their surviving friend finally tells a chilling truth. She was given a rusted key and a secret map from a dying man, a confession that revealed the explorers weren't just lost. They were trapped behind a sealed blast door that should never have locked. What really happened in that dark, airless room? Subscribe so you don't miss what they find when they finally open that door. And tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love seeing where our audience tunes in from. October came to Gull's Head, Maine, the way it always did, with a sharp, clean bite in the air that smelled of salt and pine needles. For 14 years, that bite had reminded Ruth Carter of another autumn chill, one that had settled in her bones and never quite left. But on a Tuesday afternoon in 1995, something new arrived. It came in a plain manila envelope, thin and anonymous, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog for garden supplies. There was no return address. Her name and street were printed in blocky, uncertain letters, the ink slightly feathered as if the pen had been held in a trembling hand. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation. Just 2 small, heavy things that slid into her palm. The first was a key. It was old and rusted, the kind of iron that stained your fingers with a coppery scent. The head was a simple oval, and stamped into the metal, faint but clear, were the characters B12. It was tied with a piece of frayed cord, greasy with age. The second was a piece of paper, folded into a tight square. It was a page torn from a hospital notepad, the kind with a pale blue letterhead from the regional medical center. On it, a crude sketch showed the outline of a concrete wall, a door, and a small square hatch off to the side, marked with an X. Below the sketch, in the same shaky print as the envelope, was a message of just 6 words. A command, a plea. Tell the mothers, open the room. M. The letter M hung in the air, a ghost initial that needed no last name, Marcus. It had to be. After all these years, after the silence, after the town had settled into its long, quiet grief, a voice from a deathbed had reached out. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. The key felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight of responsibility. She walked on unsteady legs from her front hall to the kitchen, past the framed photos of nieces and nephews, and opened the door to her pantry. It was deep and cool, smelling of dried herbs and floor wax. In the very back, behind a stack of canning jars and a forgotten bag of rock salt, was a dusty red tube. It was made of cardboard, wrapped in a faded oilcloth-like material, capped at both ends with tin. She had found it near the trailhead, tucked into a fern hollow, just hours after her friends had vanished. In the chaos of the initial search, in the fog of her own shock and guilt, she had picked it up and taken it home, and there it had stayed. She had never shown it to anyone. Fear, a cold and selfish thing, had told her it was nothing. Shame had told her it was a secret she had to keep. Now, the key in her hand was a judgment. It was telling her the time for silence was over. With stiff fingers, she worked the tin cap off the tube. The air that escaped was stale, the scent of old paper and graphite. She slid the contents out onto her kitchen table. It was an oilcloth chart, a hand-drawn map of the old WWIE listening bunker carved into the cliffs. It showed the main corridor, the side rooms, the generator housing. And there, near the primary blast door labeled B12, was a faint pencil annotation Marcus must have drawn. It was a dotted line leading to a maintenance shaft, the very one from the hospital sketch. A shaft no one had ever searched, because it wasn't on any of the official military blueprints the search teams had used. Tucked inside the rolled chart was a loose sheet of notepad paper with Ellie's neat, careful handwriting. It was a list of supplies they'd brought: flashlights, batteries, a first aid kit. And at the bottom, a quick calculation. Low tide, 6:10 p.m. Slack tide approx. 30 min, egress, NLT 6:45. But Ruth remembered the storm. The official report said the tide had surged early, a freak occurrence. Yet the numbers on Ellie's note, the ones they were working from, didn't account for a sudden storm. It didn't add up. It never had. For 14 years, Ruth had carried the weight of her choice to stay quiet. Now, holding the key and the map, a different weight settled on her. Resolve. She found the number in her old address book, a name she hadn't called in years. Walter Pike, the retired Coast Guard chief who had led the initial search. The phone rang 3 times before his familiar, gravelly voice answered. Ruth's own voice was tight, thin. She told him what she had. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled not with judgment, but with the sound of a man processing a ghost. Then, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "Bring what you have. No speeches, just truth." The memory hit her then, sharp and vivid as she hung up the phone. September 12, 1981, a perfect late summer Saturday. The 6 of them laughing as they piled out of Marcus's beat-up Ford Bronco at the trailhead. The air was warm, thick with the scent of sun-baked pine. Ellie Morse, her silver locket glinting, was trying to tame her brother Tommy's hair, which was sticking out from under his blue mariner's cap. Lena Ortiz was already taking pictures with her Polaroid, writing the time, 4:30 p.m., on the white border of a shot of the trail marker. Marcus, confident and charming, was explaining the layout of the bunker. He said he'd found a way in, a cool piece of history no one ever saw. It was supposed to be a quick adventure, an hour tops. But on the steep, root-laced path down to the cliffs, Ruth's foot had slipped on a patch of damp moss. A sharp, grinding pain shot through her ankle. She tried to walk it off, but it was no use. It was swelling fast. "You guys go on," she'd said, forcing a smile, propping herself up against a granite boulder. "I'll be fine right here. Don't have all the fun without me." The others hesitated, but she insisted. They descended into the shadows of the cliff face, their voices echoing and then fading. Ruth sat nursing her ankle, watching the gulls circle over the water. And then the world changed. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, seemed to darken at the edges. A sudden, strange stillness fell over the forest. The birds went quiet. Then came the pressure drop. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a deep, resonant thump in her ears, like a giant's hand had been pressed against the world. It was the feeling of a door closing, somewhere far away and deep within the earth. The wind turned in an instant, cold and wet, and the sky opened up. The bunker was a wound in the granite cliffs, a dark mouth breathing cold, damp air that smelled of rust and century-old stillness. Inside, the world was concrete and echoes. The beam from Tommy's flashlight cut a shaky circle through the dark, dancing down the long main corridor. It was like walking into the throat of some sleeping giant. They passed side rooms with rotted wooden shelves and empty alcoves where equipment once hummed with secrets. Their destination was at the end of the passage, a massive circular blast door made of reinforced steel, with the designation B-12 stenciled in faded white paint. Beyond it, a service tunnel led to the prize, the old coastal listening room, with its panoramic concrete embrasures looking out over the sea. Lena, ever the documentarian, raised her Polaroid. A flashbulb popped, momentarily bleaching the darkness and freezing the 4 of them in time. Ellie with a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder, Tommy grinning with bravado, and Marcus standing with one hand on the huge wheel of the blast door. She pulled the photo from the camera, gave it a little shake, and with a fine-tipped pen, she carefully wrote on the white border, 5:50 p.m. at B12. Low tide, 6:10 p.m. The plan was simple. A quick look around the listening room, and they'd be back out on the trail before the tide even thought about turning. They would be home for dinner. Outside, propped against a salt-strafed boulder, Ruth watched the fog roll in. The foghorns from the lighthouse began their mournful, two-toned call, a sound that was the heartbeat of Gull's head. Her ankle was a dull, throbbing ache. She had teased Tommy about his bright blue mariner's cap just before they went in. telling him it was so loud it would scare the ghosts away. He just grinned and pulled the brim down low. Now she scanned the darkening horizon, a knot of impatience tightening in her stomach. The air was getting heavy, the light turning a strange, bruised yellow. Inside, the group was having trouble with the door. B12 was supposed to be decommissioned, locked tight. But Marcus, with a confident smirk, explained he'd found it slightly ajar on a previous visit. "The track is jammed," he said, his voice echoing in the concrete tube. "But I think I can get it open." He pulled something from his pocket. It was the key. Not the B12 key Ruth would one day hold, but a smaller, simpler one. "What's that for?" Ellie asked, her nursing student caution kicking in. "Just a secondary latch," Marcus said, a little too smoothly. "An old maintenance lock. It's for safety. Keeps the whole thing from slamming shut if there's a pressure change." He slid the key into a small, almost hidden keyhole near the main wheel, and with a grunt he turned it. There was a sharp click, and the massive door seemed to relax, shifting a few inches with a low groan. Together, he and Tommy put their shoulders to it, and the great steel plug swung inward, opening a path into the deeper darkness. That's when the storm hit. It didn't arrive. It struck. The wind came first, a physical blow that tore through the pines and hit the cliff face with a shriek. Then the rain, not falling but driving sideways in hard, cold sheets. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Water began to sluice down the granite rock face, pouring into the low spots around the bunker's entrance. Ruth pulled her jacket tighter, shielding her face. She was listening for their voices, for the sound of them emerging, laughing about the dark. Instead, she heard a sound that didn't belong. It was a sharp, metallic clank that came from deep within the cliff, a sound of heavy metal seating into place. It was followed a second later by a sound that shook the very ground she sat on. It was a low, hollow boom. It wasn't loud like an explosion. It was deep, resonant, and utterly final. It was the sound of a vault being sealed. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "Ellie!" she screamed into the wind, her voice swallowed by the gale. "Marcus, can you hear me?" For a moment, there was nothing but the howl of the storm. Then a voice, faint and distorted by the stone and distance. It was Ellie. "We're okay. Door's a little sticky. We'll be 5 minutes." The words were meant to be reassuring, but they were a death sentence. They didn't know. They couldn't know what Ruth had heard. Before she could shout again, the drainage channel that ran along the base of the cliff surged. A wave of churning, brackish water, pushed by the storm surge, flooded the entrance to the bunker, swirling around the path they had taken. It was cold and fast, pulling at her good leg. Heart hammering against her ribs, Ruth scrambled backward, pulling herself up onto the higher ground of the main trail, away from the rising water. The entrance was now a churning mess of seawater and foam. Her friends were on the other side of a sealed steel door, a door that Marcus said he was making safe, a door that shouldn't lock, but it had. The weeks that followed were a blur of flashing lights, grim-faced volunteers, and the constant, mournful barking of search dogs. The official search for the 4 missing explorers was massive, methodical, and ultimately fruitless. Search teams combed every inch of the pine forest. Divers, their movements slow and ghostly in the murky water, explored the tidal flats and the submerged ledges below the cliffs. They rappelled down the rock face, their headlamps cutting feeble beams into the dark crevices. The bunker itself was searched top to bottom, every room, every corridor. They pried at the B12 blast door, but it was sealed as tight as a tomb. Engineers brought in from the naval base confirmed it hadn't been opened in decades. The locking mechanism was rusted solid from the outside. The official maps, the ones the military provided, showed no other entrances or exits. The case file grew thick with reports, witness statements, and topographic charts peppered with red X's marking every grid square that had been cleared. The final report concluded that the 4 youths were likely caught by the freak storm surge and swept out to sea. It was a neat, tragic, and official story, but for some, it never fit. Agnes Morse, Ellie and Tommy's mother, rejected the idea with a quiet, furious certainty that was more powerful than any shout. Her children were not careless. Ellie was a nursing student who planned everything. They wouldn't have been caught by the tide. But her grief was dismissed as denial, and the town, desperate for closure, slowly began to accept the official narrative. The porch light at the Morse house, however, stayed on. Every single night, its small, defiant glow cut through the darkness, a silent vigil against a story that felt like a lie. Chief Walter Pike, the man who had overseen the search, retired a year later. But he didn't let the case go. He kept a private set of notebooks at home, filled with his own observations. Something had always bothered him about the tide tables submitted in the official report. They looked too clean, too perfect, as if they'd been copied from an almanac rather than recorded from real-time observations on a day when a storm had thrown all predictions out the window. He'd noted the sudden pressure drop, the way the wind had shifted, things that could make a heavy, balanced door behave in unpredictable ways. But without a body, without a single piece of evidence, his suspicions were just that, the lingering doubts of a cop who hated loose ends. The town of Gull's Head learned to live around the gap left by the four. It became a scar, tender to the touch but eventually part of the landscape. Ruth Carter, however, never healed. Guilt was a stone in her gut. Every time she saw Agnes Morse at the grocery store, her gaze would drop to the floor. She couldn't bear the kindness in Agnes's eyes, a kindness that felt like an accusation. The red map tube in her pantry became a symbol of her cowardice. She'd told herself it was irrelevant, that the search teams had better maps. But deep down, she knew it showed a maintenance shaft no one else knew about. Fear kept her silent. Fear of being blamed. Fear of reopening a wound. Fear of what they might find. So she hid it away and tried to forget. She started attending a small church on the edge of town, listening to a new pastor who spoke of confession and letting the light in. The words washed over her but never sank in. The darkness inside felt too heavy. While the town grieved, others prospered. Ray Cordray, the owner of a respectable little antique shop on Main Street, began to expand his business. His store, once filled with dusty furniture and chipped china, started to feature more unique items. A set of brass naval binoculars, a ship's chronometer, a stack of WWIE-ray supply crates stenciled with surplus numbers. When asked where he found such treasures, Cordray would just smile his polished shopkeeper's smile and talk about picker's luck and having a good eye for found history. No one questioned the lack of provenance. No one connected the dots. The years passed. Lena Ortiz's parents, hollowed out by their loss, donated all of her photography equipment to the local high school. They packed up her darkroom, her lenses, her tripods. But in the box with her favorite Polaroid camera, the one she'd taken to the bunker, the last 3 photos from the film pack were missing. Another small, nagging detail that went unnoticed. September became a cruel month in Gull's Head. The crisp air and changing leaves were a reminder of hard weather and harder anniversaries. The story of the lost explorers became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to teenagers about the dangers of the cliffs. The bunker was eventually sealed with a chain-link fence and a warning sign. The porch light still burned at the Morse house, a stubborn beacon of a mother's hope, but for the rest of the town, the case was closed. It was a tragedy, a mystery, but one they had learned to live with, a hollow space they had carefully built their lives around. The hospice was a quiet place on the edge of town, a building designed for final whispers and difficult truths. Ruth had gotten the call from a nurse who said a patient was asking for her, and only her. The name the nurse gave her was Marcus Hale. When Ruth walked into the room, she barely recognized him. The charismatic, confident gearhead she remembered from 1981 was gone. In his place was a man whittled down by sickness, his skin thin as paper, his breath a shallow rattle in his chest. But his eyes were lucid. They were filled with a desperate, burning clarity. He had been waiting for her. He gestured for her to come closer, and she pulled a chair to his bedside. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and in his gaze, she saw 14 years of stored-up shame. His voice, when it came, was a dry rustle, but the words were sharp, each one a shard of glass. He admitted everything. The story began not with adventure, but with greed. Sometime, in the months before that September day, Marcus had fallen in with Ray Cordray. Cordray, the respectable antiques dealer, was running an illegal salvage ring. He was using local kids, desperate for cash, to move found historical artifacts from forgotten places. The bunker wasn't just a cool spot to explore, it was a clandestine warehouse. Cordray had discovered that naval surplus crates, some filled with valuable instruments and memorabilia, had been sealed inside one of the decommissioned chambers decades ago. He'd given Marcus a key, the B12 key, and a map to a hidden maintenance shaft, paying him to quietly move the crates out, one or two at a time. On that Saturday, Marcus hadn't planned on bringing his friends, but they were eager for an adventure, and he was eager to show off. He told himself it would be fine. He'd lead them to the main listening room, let them look around, and they'd be none the wiser about the crates stacked neatly in the chamber behind the B12 door. He had a crate ready to move that night, after he'd taken the others home. That was the plan. He used his own small key on the secondary latch, the one he'd lied about being for safety. It was actually a bypass that allowed the main wheel to turn. Then, with a grunt, he and Tommy swung the heavy blast door open. But he'd made a mistake. He had left one of Cordray's crates too close to the door track. He didn't notice it in the dark. When the storm hit and the pressure dropped with that sudden violent thump, it created a powerful vacuum effect in the long corridor. The massive steel door, designed to withstand an explosion, was sucked inward. The crate jammed the track just enough to prevent it from seating perfectly, but it was enough to trap them. "Panic," he said, tasted like pennies in his mouth. He told the others to wait, that he'd be right back. "Sit tight 5 minutes," he'd called out, his voice shaking. "I'll just check the vent." It was a lie. He knew the main ventilation system had been sealed for years. He was running. He scrambled to the maintenance shaft, the secret entrance only he and Cordray knew about. The ladder inside, he discovered, was a skeleton of rotted wood. He tried to climb down, to get back to them, but a rung snapped. He fell, injuring his leg, and a wave of pure, selfish terror washed over him. He fled. He didn't call for help. He didn't dial 911. The ring, he explained, had ears everywhere. Cordray had made it clear that anyone who talked to the authorities would face consequences far worse than a breaking and entering charge. He was a coward. That was his word for it. A coward who left his friends to die in the dark. He crawled back to the site 2 nights later, under the cover of darkness, while the official search was focused on the coastline. He went to the maintenance shaft and listened. There was nothing, just a dead, heavy silence. The air coming from the shaft was stale, thin. He knew then that it was too late, so he lied. He lied to the sheriff. He lied to the families. He lied to Ruth. He gave a statement about being separated from the group near the trail, about seeing them head toward the cliffs just as the storm rolled in. His lie became the foundation of the official story, and he had lived with it, he whispered, every single day for 14 years. The confession exhausted him, leaving him breathless. With a final, trembling effort, he reached under his pillow. He pressed 2 objects into Ruth's hand. The first was the rusted B12 key. The second was the folded sketch of the maintenance shaft, drawn on a hospital notepad. His fingers were cold, his grip surprisingly strong. He looked her in the eye, his gaze locking onto hers, and he whispered the one word that tied it all together, the name of the man who had profited from it all. Cordray. It was a voice from the grave, a confession that finally cracked the case wide open, and a key that would unlock a room that had held its secrets for far too long. There was no drama, no shouted accusations or tearful speeches. Ruth Carter walked into the Gull's Head Sheriff's office the next morning and laid everything on the desk of Sheriff Nora Bell: the red map tube, the rusted B12 key, the sketch from the hospice. She explained what Marcus had told her, her voice steady and clear, recounting the facts without embellishment. Sheriff Bell, a patient, methodical woman who hated neat official stories that didn't add up, listened without interruption. She picked up each artifact with a gloved hand, placing it into a separate evidence bag. She then made one phone call to Chief Walter Pike. An hour later, Pike was in the office, his old notebooks open on the table, comparing his tide and pressure notes from 1981 with the information from Marcus's confession. It all clicked into place. The theory he'd harbored for 14 years finally had a mechanism. This wasn't about theories anymore. This was about evidence. Sheriff Bell, armed with Ruth's testimony, Marcus's deathbed confession, and Pike's corroborating data, went to a judge. She didn't ask for a sweeping warrant to tear the whole place apart. She asked for a narrow one, permission to search the specific maintenance shaft indicated on the sketch and, if deemed safe, the sealed chamber B12. The warrant was signed before noon. A small, quiet crew assembled at the trailhead that afternoon. Sheriff Bell, Chief Pike, a forensic team, and a crew from the County Public Works Department armed with bolt cutters and heavy tools. They followed the path down to the cliffs, not to the main bunker entrance, but to a spot 50 yards to the north, a patch of overgrown brush just as Marcus's sketch had shown. Under a thick carpet of moss and lichened planks that looked like natural deadfall, they found it. A square concrete cap, its iron handles rusted into place. It was exactly where the map said it would be. The crew pried it open with a crowbar. A wave of cold, stagnant air washed over them. A forensic technician lowered an atmospheric meter into the darkness. The numbers came back instantly. Oxygen poor, high levels of carbon dioxide, unsurvivable. They spent the next hour ventilating the shaft, pumping fresh air in until the meter gave an all clear. Then, with safety lines and breathing apparatus on standby, a single officer descended the new, sturdy ladder they'd brought. He confirmed the shaft led to a small landing outside a heavy steel door, the B12 door. From the inside, the team brought the rusted key down. With Sheriff Bell and Chief Pike watching on a remote camera feed, the officer slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, then, with a sharp crack of rusted metal, it turned. The locking mechanism disengaged. After 14 years, the blast door gave way with a tired, metallic sigh, swinging inward into the darkness of the chamber. What they found inside was not a scene of chaos or horror. It was a scene of quiet, heartbreaking order. Against one wall were the neat stacks of naval surplus crates, their stenciled markings clear in the beam of the forensic lights. And on a wide, flat-topped crate, placed as carefully as items on a family mantelpiece, were the personal effects of the 4 explorers: a small pocket tape recorder, a strip of 3 Polaroid photos, a blue mariner's cap, a silver locket shaped like a clover, and on the concrete wall behind them, there were chalk marks, a series of tally marks, organized in groups of 5, stopping at 12. Beside them, a short, simple prayer note had been scrawled in the same chalk, in Ellie Morse's unmistakable handwriting: "Tell Mom we tried." Psalm 23. Below it, another note: "Low tide 6:10" had been crossed out, and corrected with the words, "Tide rose early." It was an undeniable, perfectly preserved cluster of proof. The forensic team carefully bagged each item. They played the tape from the pocket recorder. The battery was nearly dead, but the audio was clear enough. 2 minutes of calm, practical voices. Ellie's, steadying the others, talking about conserving the flashlight batteries. Then, distinctly, a voice from the other side of the door. From the corridor, Marcus Hale. "Sit tight 5 minutes, I've got this." The 3 Polaroids told the rest of the story. Photo 1, timestamped 6:21 p.m. All 4 of them, their faces illuminated by the flash, their expressions calm, if a little concerned. Tommy was flashing his cap at the camera. Lena's note, on the border. Door sticky, waiting. Polaroid 2, time, stamped 6:33 p.m. The smiles were gone, replaced by forced resolve. There was water at their ankles. A hand, Lena's, was pointing toward the sealed vent louvers high on the wall. The final piece of the puzzle was tucked inside the lid of one of the crates: ledger pages, listing inventory numbers and sales dates, all tied to Cordray Antiques. It was the motive, the timeline, and the mechanism, all laid out in a cold, silent room. Outside the police cordon, on the cliffside overlook, Agnes Morse stood with Ruth. When Sheriff Bell approached them, her face gentle, Agnes already knew. She didn't ask what they found. She simply looked at the sheriff and nodded. Later that evening, for the first time in 14 years, 5,110 days, the porch light at the Morse house went dark. Agnes wept, not with the sharp agony of fresh grief, but with the bone-deep relief of truth, her head resting on Ruth's shoulder. Sheriff Nora Bell didn't go to Cordray Antiques with sirens blazing. She went alone, in an unmarked car, and walked in just as Ray Cordray was polishing a silver tea service. He greeted her with his practiced, welcoming smile, asking if she was looking for anything in particular. Sheriff Bell didn't answer. She simply placed a clear evidence bag on the glass countertop. Inside were the ledger pages found in the bunker. Cordray's smile didn't just vanish. It seemed to slide off his face, leaving behind a slack, gray mask of fear. He began to bluster, talking about picker's luck and how he acquired items from all sorts of estate sales. But his eyes were fixed on the ledger, on the familiar handwriting of a young man he'd paid to do his dirty work. When Sheriff Bell quietly stated the charge, involuntary manslaughter, 4 counts, he froze. There was no chase, no struggle. The fight had gone out of him. The arrest was quiet, the shop sealed with police tape. The news rippled through Gull's head, not like a shockwave, but like a slow, rising tide of understanding. Suddenly, all the odd finds in Cordray's shop over the years made a terrible kind of sense. Within days, people who had bought certain items began returning them, wanting no part of the stolen history that had cost 4 young people their lives. The items were catalogued, their naval markings cross-referenced, and a quiet process of repatriating them to the proper military archives began. The press conference was held in the town hall, not for spectacle, but for clarity. Sheriff Bell laid out the timeline, and Chief Pike, standing beside her, explained the mechanics of what had happened in the bunker. He spoke not of monsters, but of physics, the storm surge, the barometric pressure drop, the vacuum effect on the heavy door, and the inevitable, tragic outcome of hypoxia. It was a short, merciful window, he explained. There would have been no prolonged suffering. It was a small comfort, but a vital one. The state of Maine officially amended the findings of the 1,981 case, and the ugly rumor that the 4 had run away finally died, not in whispers, but on paper. Then Ruth Carter stepped up to the microphone. She spoke plainly, her voice shaking but sure. She told the town about her guilt, about the red map tube she had hidden, and about the fear that had kept her silent. She didn't ask for pity. She just told her truth. She explained that she came forward now because a dying man had given her the key, and because the mothers of her friends deserved to know. She spoke of Marcus Hale not as a villain, but as a flawed, frightened young man who, in the end, had chosen to do the right thing. A week later, the town gathered at the small church Ruth attended. It was a memorial service, but it felt more like a reclamation. The 4 chairs, at the front of the sanctuary, were empty, but they were not vacant. On each one sat a single, poignant object. Ellie's silver locket, polished and gleaming. Tommy's blue mariner's cap, a little faded but still bright. A framed copy of one of Lena's beautiful, stark photographs of the Maine coastline. And for Marcus, a simple, clean key, representing the one he had finally passed on. Agnes Morse was the first of the parents to speak. Her voice didn't waver. She stood before the town, her gaze sweeping over the familiar faces, and she set the record straight. They were brave, she said, her words ringing with certainty. They waited for help. They were practical and they stayed together. We are the ones who took this long to find them. After the service, Ruth found Agnes standing by the church entrance. She looked at the woman, who had shown her nothing but kindness for 14 years, and finally said the words that had been lodged in her throat for a decade and a half. Agnes, I am so sorry. Can you forgive me? Agnes Morse looked at her, and her expression was one of profound, weary compassion. She pulled Ruth into a firm embrace. "There is nothing to forgive," she said softly. "You were a child too, scared and alone. We forgive by enduring this together." It wasn't an erasure of the past. It was an acknowledgement of shared pain, of a burden finally set down. Justice had named the monster, and compassion had made room for the flawed confessor. Accountability, the town was learning, was not the same as vengeance. It was simply light, pouring into all the dark places. The town did not try to erase the bunker. Instead, they chose to remember. After the investigation was complete, the main entrance to the concrete structure was permanently sealed with a thick wall of reinforced concrete, ensuring no one could ever wander into its darkness again. But the chamber, B12, was treated with a different kind of reverence. Engineers stabilized the site, and where the heavy steel door once stood, they installed a thick, sealed panel of shatterproof glass. A new path was cleared, a gentle trail of crushed stone that led from the main cliffside walk to a small, safe overlook. It was named the Trail of Light. Along the path, simple bronze plaques were installed, their text written not by a committee, but by Chief Pike and Sheriff Bell. They didn't just say, "Keep out." They explained why. "Abandoned structures are unstable and often have unbreathable air," one read. Another, near the trailhead, said, "Always leave a written plan with a responsible adult. Include your route and your return time." They were simple, practical lessons born from a terrible loss. Through the viewing panel, in the controlled, low-level light installed inside, you could still see the chalk marks on the far wall, a permanent, silent testament. The healing of Gull's Head was quiet and deliberate. A scholarship fund was established in the names of Ellie Morse and Lena Ortiz. Each year, it would help a promising nursing student and a young photography major from the local high school, turning their lost potential into a new generation's opportunity. Tommy Morse's blue mariner's cap was placed in the school's trophy case, not as a symbol of tragedy, but of loyalty and spirit. It sat beside championship trophies and debate team plaques, a quiet reminder that being a good friend was the greatest prize of all. The artifacts recovered from the bunker were handled with care. The naval instruments, once destined for Ray Cordray's illicit market, were documented and given to the State Historical Museum. But the personal items, the silver locket, the camera, the tape recorder, were returned to the families, private treasures brought back into the light, and Ruth Carter found her own way forward. She joined the county's volunteer search and rescue team. She learned how to read a topographic map, how to use a radio, how to tie a proper rescue knot. The guilt that had held her captive for 14 years was transformed into a fierce, protective energy. She started speaking at the high school, not as a victim, but as a survivor with a crucial message. She talked to teenagers about planning, about checking real, same-day weather forecasts, not just relying on what you think you know. She told them to carry extra batteries and a whistle, and to have the courage to turn back when conditions change. She was teaching them the things she wished she and her friends had known. One clear, cool afternoon in late autumn, a year after the door was opened, Ruth sat on a bench on the overlook with Agnes Morse. They each held a thermos of hot tea, the steam ghosting in the crisp air. They didn't talk much. They just watched the gulls tilt and soar on the wind over the endless blue water. Below them, at the trailhead, a new light had been installed. It wasn't a harsh spotlight, but a warm, sensible beacon that would switch on automatically at dusk. The town had insisted on it, a collective decision born from a single porch light that had burned for so long. It was a simple thing, a testament to a simple truth. Simple things save lives. As the sun began to set, it cast a golden light across the cliff face. A warm beam poured through the glass viewing panel of the B12 memorial, illuminating the chalked words on the wall. The camera of your mind's eye might hold on that image for a moment, a prayer from a sealed room, now bathed in light. Then it would lift, panning out over the water, past the circling gulls, toward the steadfast, blinking eye of the distant lighthouse. Some doors, the kind made of steel and fear, close forever. Others, the kind made of truth and courage, We learn to open together.